Okay, well, good morning or good evening or whenever this happens to be. And thanks for tuning in, arriving, opening, whatever we're doing, this version of Foundation Design 3100. And so what we're going to do today is just go over some of the concepts that's going to come up in a reading that we're going to do. And what we should be thinking about here are just some of the major concepts as we move through. This reading will be linked on the website as usual. If you don't see it there, just let me know. And as always, if you're having any difficulty accessing any of the readings, let me know right away. So the concepts that we're going to be taking a look at here are going to be really applying semiotics to product design. We've looked at applying semiotics to some media such as packaging and advertising and the built environment like playgrounds. And what we want to do is think about specifically how it applies to product design. So there's a quote here I want to read out first of all. To grow up and socialize today does, to a large extent, depend on learning a complex system of signs and codes. And what the author means by this really is that in order to grow up, work in society, to deal with other people, we need to understand not just as decoders, but as users of a whole lot of different systems of signs and codes. She talks about this being one system. We could talk about it being a bunch of different systems that interrelate. Doesn't really matter, to be honest. And through this class, we've looked at starting with the sort of basic atomic unit of the sign, and then looking at what for us is much more important, the idea of codes, that we have these bodies, these groups, these systems of signs that are used for particular purposes. So as we've done a number of times, we're moving in this class from looking at individual signs that we still need to talk about and identify, classify those, discuss what they mean, but more importantly, to understand how meaning is created. Because really, what semiotics is about is the transference and maintenance of systems of meaning, which for us are essentially going to be signs and codes. And to start off, when we think about product design, we're going to go back to some terms that we've used a bunch of times already, connotation and denotation. So in terms of words, we think about connotation as what a word or concept reminds us of. That is, the things that it brings to mind, as opposed to its denotation, which is what it absolutely means. So an example might be the number 13. The number 13 is the number on the number line between 12 and 14. It means a particular quantity. It's a prime number, a bunch of things like that. Those are all denotations. That is, we can agree exactly what they mean. On the other hand, at least in some cultures, the number 13 is associated with unluckiness and death and misfortune. That's a connotation. It suggests that. There's no absolute agreement that it means that. And in lots of fields like mathematics, nobody particularly cares whether a number is lucky, unlucky, or anything else. So we think of denotation as how something is used, and connotation is its value or what it means to us, not just to me, but to everybody. And one of the things we have to think about is, how much can we separate connotation and denotation? They're going to be linked together, but we can typically look at how much agreement there is as to what something means. Now, another important concept that we've seen already, we've seen it in Barth and we've seen it in a number of other cases, is this idea of myth. And myth are those normally invisible or hard to locate structures that underlie a whole lot of signification. So the idea for Barth is that there's three levels of signification. You have denotation, what we agree on things to mean. You have connotation, what it reminds you of. And myth is even below that, that the meanings it carries that you may not even be normally conscious of. So for Barth, myths are those dominant ideologies. They're the ways those dominant ideologies that are expressed through any kind of meaning-making process. So in his book Mythologies, he talked about how dominant ideologies might be expressed through things like the design of a car, for example, or the use of a particular imagery in an ad. And they make those values seem normal or natural. That is, it's just always going to be that way, or that's just the way it is. Those are statements of myth. I mean, why do cars use a certain language of speed and aggression? Why do we associate factory produced food with images of markets and farmers? Well, that just seems normal to us. It seems to be the way it's done, even though when you think about it, may not make a whole lot of sense at some level. So beyond that connotative and denotative meaning, signs can have mythic meaning as well. Now, a quote here from the author Adrian Forty, who's written a bunch of really interesting books about the use of industrial design and the meanings of industrial design, and I'll put some links to those on the website later on. Unlike the more or less ephemeral media, design has the capacity to cast myths into enduring, solid, and tangible form so that they seem to be reality itself. What does that mean? Well, let's think about some of the medias that we've looked at already. Things like films or books or speeches or TV shows are ephemeral. That is, they disappear. You turn it off, you stop watching, it's not there anymore. Some things might be a little bit more permanent, like an ad in a magazine or a packaging for a consumer product, but that too is basically ephemeral. You're going to throw it away. One moment it's there, the next moment it's gone. You replace it with something else. But design, and we're thinking here about the design of useful things and more or less permanent things like architecture or industrial design, really seems like it's just reality. If you're walking down a street and you're looking at the buildings, you don't think of these as things that have been created to serve a particular myth or to connote something. They're just there. It's not like when you leave a movie theater, the movie is gone, but the building is still there. That seems to be an enduring reality. And what makes design of products and to a larger extent spaces interesting in terms of myth is that they seem very real. I mean, that seems like reality, even though all of that has been designed. The streets that you walk down, the products that you use, the vehicles that you drive, those have all been designed, and they've been designed to express a particular set of values. And so what we're going to do is look at a couple of, case studies. And one of the case studies that we're going to look at is the idea of brutalism. So brutalism is an architectural term, and although the word brutal in English associates with monsters and power and being brutalized or attacked, it really comes from the French for raw concrete, béton brut. But the idea that the architecture that has been produced through this scheme is somehow aggressive or difficult or not particularly suitable for most kind of human interactions is interesting in that term brutalism has been kept, even though it was not originally something that was designed to talk about this type of architecture at all. The idea really was to simply speak about the materials that were used, but it sort of adopted this name. And we're familiar with brutalist architecture. The Killam Library at Dal is an example of this. But we've seen, especially through the 1960s, 1970s, a whole lot of architecture that is clearly brutalist. And what's the definition of it? Well, first of all, the use of raw, unfinished, or very simply finished concrete. Rather than covering up that concrete is there. The idea that you use space and form primarily, that rather than use decoration, we're using the massing of the building to sort of communicate the meaning. And we can get into a long discussion about the pros and cons of brutalism, but the two things I think that are useful us to think about is, on one hand, it was very popular with architects and the people who bought the services of architects for quite a long time. You take a look at a lot of campus architecture in Canada, public architecture, hospitals, schools, that sort of thing. There's all kinds of it that's out there, but also it has not always been particularly popular even when it was being designed and developed in its heyday. And the example that we're probably can access the most easily is Scotia Square. If you walk around Scotia Square on the outside of it, you're going to see a whole lot of planes of concrete. You're going to see, bare concrete that's in some cases very bad shape. And one of the unfortunate things about brutalism is that it turns out, especially in our climate, concrete doesn't really last too well, and it stains and it crumbles and it has damage from salt and freezing, a bunch of things like that. But that's a pretty good example of brutalist architecture. Now, what's happened over time is big chunks of Scotia Square have been covered over with colored metal cladding to try to make it a little less brutalist looking, and there's been windows put in. But if we take a look, and we'll find some slides later on, I'll post them at some point, of the original way that Scotia Square was looking, it was very much an example of that kind of architectural brutalism. And so this is us thinking about, what does a built product like architecture, not just what does it do, but what does it suggest? And one of the interesting things about what it suggests is that you hear people talk about these buildings as looking like prisons or fortresses or military fortifications. That is a whole lot of connotations, very much opposed to what these buildings are usually used for. These buildings that we see on this slide here, these are all libraries. But they don't have any of the visual language of libraries of, let's say, the 19th century, or the 20th century, even for much of the early 20th century. They look, quite a bit different, and they have a clear set of connotational values. And whether you think of that as being modern and contemporary, or whether you think of that as looking like something that people shouldn't be involved with, that's up to you. So in order to think about this in terms of some examples of product design, we're going to use chairs as an example, same example that's used in the reading. And chairs are interesting for a number of reasons. And one is that although they all are supposed to do pretty much the same thing, that is, we understand what a chair is supposed to do, it's something you're supposed to sit down on, chairs have changed and evolved throughout the ages. And if you look at any history of furniture, you're going to see dramatic differences from century to century, culture to culture, decade to decade. And so what I want to do is give a little bit of background on the chair that's talked about here, or a couple of the chairs. So this first chair, the Matson chair, you might recognize it, or something quite close to it, even though it's from 1934. The design is getting close to 100 years old at this point. It looks an awful lot like the Poang chair that you may get at IKEA, which is still in production. It's a similar kind of construction, and it's coming from a similar place. It's a Swedish chair. And this comes out of a intellectual movement or a cultural context, which we might call a myth, which is expressed in terms of design as a school called functionalism, or Swedish functionalism. And really what is at the core of functionalism is modern or contemporary, well-built, affordable, tasteful furniture that's designed for everybody, not one set of looks or materials or techniques for the poorer people and something else for the wealthier people, something that we've seen a lot through history. But the idea that everyone gets access to something that is pleasant, that works, that's durable, that's modestly priced, and that doesn't really speak of class distinctions. And in Sweden of that era was a society that was working towards much more in terms of equality between rich and poor and social classes, and the idea that everyone was equal and everyone had equal opportunity is something that's a mythos that's expressed through that. Now, of course, in reality, not everyone was exactly equal, and there were still wealthy people and poorer people and social issues, etc. But the mythos that this chair is coming out of is one of equality, practicality, etc. And you actually still see some of that today. We've looked at some examples using Volvo as cars, and Volvos have a certain set of signifiers in terms of being practical and durable. They're not exactly super cheap, but they don't have, super strong class distinctions, perhaps. And another example that you probably everyone's familiar with would be something like IKEA, in that it's meant to be available to everyone. It's not just for the wealthy, it's not just for the poor. The idea is that it's good design for everyone. Now, the reality of IKEA is that some of it's good design and good construction, some of it definitely is not. But if we then contrast that, the Matson chair with the Bolin chair from the 1980s, what we get is something that denotationally it does the same thing at a very basic level. That is, it's a chair, you sit on it. All chairs denotationally do basically the same thing. In terms of signification and mythos, what its connotators are, that is, what it reminds you of, what it makes you think of, and the underlying system of values, the mythos that brings that to bear, it's something very different. First of all, this is not in the functional milieu. That is, it's not trying to be simple and attractive and functional. This is coming out of a society which has seen a growing disparity between the wealthy and the not so wealthy. This is the 1980s, it's the context of early neoliberalism, and what we have is in some ways a critique or rejection of Swedish society at its time. Now you might say, okay, it's just a chair, but we need to think about what are the circumstances that makes that chair perhaps not even attractive to a whole lot of people, but even possible. Why would you create and produce this particular chair? Now, denotationally, the question that we need to ask is this a chair, a comfortable chair, a chair that you want to spend a whole lot of time in? And I think the answer pretty much universally is going to be no. I've not sat in one of those, but it doesn't take a lot of imagination to think that this is not a particularly comfortable chair. Is it for everyone? Clearly not. And if we take a look at the bottom right, you will see in that detail that these chairs were actually numbered and signed in the way a work of art does, it is signed, rather than a mass-produced product. This is not something that a furniture maker or a mass marketer like IKEA would build by the hundreds of thousands. There's a set number of these. It is meant to be a symbol. It's meant to be a work of art. It's something that you possess, and by displaying that, you are showing that you are aligned with a certain set of ideas. Now, the functionalist chair is the same in some ways. It's that if you possess this, you are aligned with a certain set of ideas. But the point is, it's a different set of ideas. If you think about who might have this chair in their house or office versus who might have this chair, it's appealing to a different group of people, but it's also doing something quite different. We have a basic societal belief in equality in the first example, and we have a societal belief in, difference between people, those who can afford and want a chair like this versus people who don't. It's clearly trying to communicate something far beyond what we might say its chairness. And this is not unique. We've seen other examples of this. This is a famous example, the Rietveld red and blue chair. This is actually from 1917. And in the same way, it is showing an alignment with a set of beliefs. It's using straight lines and strong primary or basic colors rather than complex padding, upholstery, carving, whichever. This chair still looks, somewhat contemporary, despite the fact that it's more than 100 years old. I have actually sat in one of these. It's not as uncomfortable as it looks. It is uncomfortable, though. So the point is that we're looking at what do these objects communicate, and what is the reason that they need to communicate these sorts of things. That is, there is something that's happening in society that is giving rise to an expression of something. And we've seen the same sort of thing when we looked at other built objects. We've talked about things like trucks. What is it in society that causes people to buy pickup trucks and associate themselves with imagery of the Wild West and horses and things? So one way we can think of this is if we go back to Marshall McLuhan's statement, the medium is the message. That is, it's not what is contained in something, it's the thing itself. That is, it is the process of designing and building chairs that is the message, rather than something that's contained within that. And this is usually applied to things like television or the internet. And the way we might apply it to those type of media is that we are not particularly interested in one television show or the contents of a show or what a character says or a particular YouTube video. We're interested in how does that media change things. The fact that we have people watching television with a small number of channels in the 1970s, let's say, and a small, very constrained number of stories that can be represented, that says something. On the internet, same sort of thing. The fact that we have something like Facebook, it's Facebook itself that is changing the way we think about each other, the way we think about communication, rather than individual content. Now, the individual content is important, but what we do is we want to think about that medium. Now, one really powerful concept that we want to talk about as well is the notion of analogy or likeness. That is, things that are like something else. Now, later on in this class, we're going to talk an awful lot about metaphor, and metaphor is going to be super important, but we're going to put that off for right now. I want to concentrate on some of the examples that are given in this reading, and this is a pretty good example of something that is a likeness at a couple of levels. This is a prototype for a corded desk phone, and the name of it, Phone Book, really gives away the basic concept. It is a phone that looks and works to a certain amount, to a extent, like a book. Now, of course, in the 1980s, phone technology was a whole lot different, but what we have is a fusion of a fairly traditional desktop phone with a dial pad and then a series of page-like blades or screens that we flip over, that we can press buttons, we can access different functions, etc. So it's using the metaphor of a book as you flip through it. And that metaphor is made pretty clear by the orientation of it, the fact that it is, looks like it has a spine, it has a tabs, the way that certain types of books and address books have. And for the audience of 1986, this would have been super familiar because lots of people would have had address books and other types of notebooks that would use a similar kind of metaphor. Now, of course, we've moved far forward in terms of technology, and a phone like this doesn't make sense in the current context, but it's a good example of a metaphor in industrial design. Now let's go back to Roland Barthes, because we always go back to Roland Barthes at some level. So here's a quote. "No sooner is a form seen than it must resemble something. Humanity seems doomed to analogy." Now what does he mean by that? He means that when you look at something or you perceive something or you understand something through your senses, you can't help but think of what it reminds you of. You look at the front of a car, it looks like a face. You can't help it. You look at something you've never seen before and it reminds you of something else, and you try to understand and decode it by things you've already seen. The fundamental way that we understand things, according to Barthes and according to a number of other researchers, is that we make connections to things we already know. This thing is like this that I already know, but with differences. Or it's like this in some ways, or it's like something else in other ways. And this is going to be something really important because analogy and metaphor are both things that connect one concept to another. Now, there's a couple of other works of design that we want to talk about, and the next is a fairly famous one by Philip Stark, and that is the Juicy Salif from 1990. This is still in production, by the way, and this is a juicer. Okay, I'm going to give you a heads up. For whatever reason, I find this product and the following quote about this product hilarious for reasons I can't really explain, and I'm going to have a really hard time getting through this with a straight face and my voice not cracking. But anyway, so this is a juicer, and it's for juicing citrus, and the idea is that you take your orange or grapefruit or whatever and you smush it across the top section, and the juice runs down to a glass that you've put underneath. In terms of form, people have said it looks like a spaceship or some kind of a virus. It's kind of unfortunate timing, I guess. But if we take a look in this next photo, we see how it's intended to be used. Now, what's the real point of this? Well, denotationally, it's a juicer. It makes juice. That's what it's for. But in terms of its real use, it is much more of a purely connotational item. It's an item that you possess in order to show it off, to show people that you have good taste, etc. Now, what leads us to think that? Well, one is that juicers are cheap and they work fairly well. You can go to the dollar store and you can buy one out of glass or plastic and it's going to do the job. This one is expensive and basically it doesn't work very well at all. If you tried to use it, you'd find juice all over the place. A small amount of juice will dribble down and go into the glass. A lot more juice is probably going to get all over the place. So one of the curators of the Design Museum in London, where they have some of the original tooling for this that was used to make it, says this about it. Stark has imbued what was a perfectly adequate kitchen drawer filler with aspirational desirabilities, indications of intellectual meaning, and a mythical lack of juicing prowess. So let's, sorry, I don't know. I've never been able to get through this without laughing. So what does he mean? Well, a perfectly adequate kitchen drawer filler, it's an ordinary device that works and nobody cares about it. There's nothing special about a regular manual juicer. They're super cheap. You might have one at home in your junk drawer. But what does Philip Stark, the designer, connect this with? Well, first of all, aspirational desirability. You use materials and design to make it look like something that you want. This was a really popular item back when it came out, and it's still being sold today. So it's a status symbol in some ways. Indications of intellectual meaning. That is, it suggests that it means something beyond just saying, I'm a juicer. It's not decorated in the way that we would think of, things from the previous century where we have elaborate decorations on things just to give them meaning and worth, but it seems to mean something. You look at it and you think there's something behind this. And finally, a mythical lack of juicing prowess. It doesn't work well at all. In many ways, this juicer is almost the exact opposite of that idea of Swedish functionalism. That is something that is affordable, that is practical, that is pleasant, but doesn't stand out. This really is something that is meant to be looked at and thought about, but in terms of being used, not so much. In reality, there was also versions of this coated with various metals like gold and silver, and some of those metals react with the acid in citrus juice so much so that you really couldn't use it without destroying the juicer itself, or at least destroying the finish. What you'd have would be something that was a beautiful metal-plated object, but if you used it for its intended purposes, you'd pretty much destroy it. Now, we contrast that with that notion of functionalism, and a quote from the functionalist designer who's quoted in the article is that design should convince, not seduce. Now, I think if we've been following along, we probably have another way of saying that, and that is that design should convince in terms of using an ethos or a logos appeal, not a pathos appeal. That is, it should be upstanding and sensible and forthright, and it shouldn't try to fool you. This juicer is something that, if it fits the way that you look at the world, might be super desirable, and you just think, I want it, rather than thinking, this is a really good juicer, this is an affordable juicer, this is something that's going to make a whole lot of sense for me to have. There's a couple of sections in the reading that we're going to sort of skip by. The discussions of tokens and types is really not very well written, and you can get into some long arguments about tokens and types. The distinction that's made here is between, in some ways, originals and replicas. That gets complicated in terms of whether we think the original is a real thing or it's sort of a mental ideal, and whether the replica is in terms of mass production or is a copy. And when we dig into this, we can sort of go back. Tokens become types and vice versa. I'm not going to worry about it in terms of this class. If we're going to treat it, we have to treat it in a more complete way. But another concept that's brought up, and this is something that we talked about last class, is that idea of syntagms and paradigms. And if we look at the definition that's used here, a syntam is an orderly combination of interacting signifiers which form a meaningful whole within a text. And so what does that mean? It means that a syntam is the structure in time or space. And then when we think about a paradigm is a series of choices that we can make. Products that belong in the same paradigm perform the same function in a given context. And so the examples we used for syntam and paradigm would be examples we used last class, a meal. In Western culture, we have a series of courses that goes in a particular order. And for each one of those courses, there's a series of choices that we can make. And if we violate that, if we have soup for dessert, or that we have only a series of salads as a series of courses, it violates those rules and expectations. And of course, those are highly determined by culture and time, but we have all kinds of other examples of paradigms where we can replace one thing or another. Clothing is another one. You have things that you put on the top of your head, you have things that you put on your feet, you have things that put on your hands, and we can interchange those. We make choices about those, but we don't have a garment that, let's say, covers your head and also includes gloves in some bizarre way. A context that's also brought up here, or concept rather, is the notion of bricolage. And bricolage really comes from the French for do-it-yourself, tinkering, making do. In cultural theory, it's often used to contrast with the notion of sort of planned design. Bricolage is this process of taking a bunch of parts and putting it together without necessarily a grand design. And examples of that could be something along the lines, if you've seen the movie Apollo 13, where they have this scene where they have to rescue the spaceship, and all they have is a bunch of parts that are on the spaceship, and they dump them all out, and they just figure out what they can sort of tape together in order to purify the atmosphere and all those sorts of things. Rather than going in with an elaborate plan and doing all kinds of research, it's tinkering, making do, etc. The bricoleur, the person who is adept at bricolage, is able to fix things with spare parts that they found, or baling wire, or duct tape, or things like that. Very much in opposition to the idea of, let's say, the architect or the industrial designer who plans and sketches and then builds prototypes and works with manufacturers and fabricators and eventually builds something to that vision. And the reason that we're talking about there is that in some ways, this is a distinction between the modernist ideal and notions of postmodernism. And that idea of modernism and postmodernism is a bit of a hard one sometimes to get around, and we'll talk about it a number of times. But in terms of the article, in the modernist hierarchy of content, form is superior to matter. Now, what does that mean? It really means that if you believe this is a definition of modernism, that it's shaping things out of nothing in a way. And it's the concept and the expression of that concept that's most important. And if we take a look at an example of high modernism, this is the Seagram Building in New York by Mies van der Rohe, the architect, and it is one of the icons of sort of high modernism. It is very carefully considered in terms of the materials and look that are used, but it is an expression in some ways of very simple form. It's a tower on a pedestal, and the ideas expressed there really emphasize the basic form and concept, the purity of materials, simplicity, and thinking about the use of the building and expressing that use, not using decoration, not using elaboration, not references to other historical norms, but really starting from scratch. And we do have to be careful in that modernism, in terms of architecture and design, really talks about a particular school of thought. If it's happening today, that doesn't mean it's modernist as in capital M modernism. And where modernism ends, if it has ended at all, is, well, discussion for another day. Now, to contrast that with postmodernism, and the article really talks about postmodernism as a return of matter. Now, what does that mean? If we're talking about architecture, architecture is something that is expressed in matter or in materials. But an example might be the Pompidou Center by Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano, where what we have is a clear expression of, and this is, a fuzzy way of putting it, but the thingness of a thing, or the fact that we see all of its guts and all of its systems in place. If we look at this building, what has happened is it has in some ways been turned inside out. What we see is the structure is visible. We see elements like the escalators, which are made visible. And if you're on the escalator, it's covered in a acrylic dome, so you can see out of it. That's that sort of zigzag structure that you see on the front of it. All of the mechanical systems, and that's things like heating, ventilation, air conditioning, etc., are made obvious, and they're all color-coded. If you take a look, the pipes are different colors. Those are expressing the use of it. And if we see it in context, in Paris, we'll see a great contrast with the surrounding architecture. This, in its time, was received in a variety of different ways. People said it looked like an oil refinery, but it has since become one of those iconic buildings. If we go back to the Seagram building, what we will see is something that we don't see exactly how it is supported, how the functions of the building work. Even though the idea in modernism is the sort of purity of form and the emphasis on materials and honesty, all that is really hidden in a way. And by the way, this is just a practical critique. Apparently, this is one of the least energy efficient buildings in all of New York. That in 1958, people didn't particularly care about how much energy you're using, and this one is very expensive to heat and cool and operate. And whether that means that it's a good building in a modern sense is, again, a discussion for some other time and place. So this is a bit of an example of walking through some of the concepts that are brought up in the article, and I want to take a look at another case study as well. So I want to talk a little bit about a design movement called streamlining. And streamlining is something that was prominent towards the sort of middle part of the 20th century and has been expressed in a number of different ways. And what's interesting about streamlining is that it's an example of moving codes from one place to another, or another way of putting it, shifting from the denotational, practical, to the connotational. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch topics again, and we've moved from architecture, and we're now going to talk about aircraft design. So here is a Boeing 80A-1 from 1929. And if you look at it, it certainly doesn't look super contemporary. But let's take a little bit of a closer look. The engines that you see there are all exposed. You can actually see the cylinders of those radial engines. It's got a exposed landing gear. You can see the wheels. There's all kinds of bracing between the wings. It's a biplane, which also suggests it's kind of an older design. The tail is very complicated. The whole thing is kind of boxy shaped, and it worked. It's functional. But it doesn't have a lot of the signifiers that we'd associate with more contemporary airplanes. And the construction of it, there's a great deal of wood and fabric in this. And that seems a little bit hard to believe, but airplanes up until well into the 1940s oftentimes used a great deal of wood as structural elements and a great deal of fabric as the covering. Lots of airplanes simply used canvas as the fuselage. So that's 1929. What we're going to do is then look only a couple years in the future. This is the Northrop Alpha from 1931. Now, it doesn't look contemporary in terms of 2020, but there has clearly been a shift. So First of all, you'll see that the material is clearly metal, and it's obviously metal. It's not painted, it's polished. It clearly wants to suggest this is made of metal. If we take a look at the landing gear, it's all covered in mostly. We can see the wheels there. The wheels don't retract on this plane, they always stay down, but they're all covered over. The engine is covered over. It's a similar kind of engine as to what we saw before, but we have this fairing around it. It's a monoplane. It only has one wing. The tail is much simpler. It does have some attributes of older aircraft. The cockpit is open. You'll see the pilot there has an open cockpit and is exposed to the elements. This was a passenger plane, and just to show you how much things have changed, the passengers did get to sit inside. I'm going to show you a view from the other side of a slightly different version of it, and you can see that the passenger compartment with the windows there was inside. The pilot still had to sit outside. This one's a little different. They've in fact removed some of the fairings over the wheels, but it still is a great distinction from, if we go back, something like this. Now, in terms of, how long this is basically happening at the same time. This is 1929 and this is 1931. These are basically happening at the same time. Now, why do we have this change? Well, if we're strictly talking about airplanes, it's primarily because advances in technology. If we simplify and refine the design of an airplane, it can fly more easily, basically. It's not a engineering class, so we don't have to get into details, but basically there's less aerodynamic drag. The fewer wires and wings and other elements that we have, the smoother it is, the more sort of teardrop shaped it is, the easier it is to fly, the less fuel it uses, the faster it goes, etc., etc. We also are using metal because metal is strong and light, and when you are flying, you want something that's strong and light. And we're also moving into, covering over the engines, and we're simplifying the control surfaces and a bunch of other things like that. The point is that at this level, in terms of airplanes, this is being done primarily for functional reasons. The aluminum wasn't painted because there was no need to paint it. Aluminum's a durable material. It was left unpainted. Other materials, canvas, steel, wood, have to be painted to protect them from the elements. Now, in the 1930s, airplanes were a symbol of newness and modernity. They had only existed for less than 30 years. And so, every airplane was a symbol of newness. In some ways, the way that we may think of, certain types of computers or smartphones or something like today. There aren't any 50-year-old smartphones. And so that mythos of modernity is being expressed in practical terms in airplanes using a certain set of signifiers, the shape, the construction, etc. What happens really quickly is that set of signifiers starts to spread into other realms. So this is a train. This is the Pioneer Zephyr, a train that ran across the U.S. From 1934. And compared to the steam engine trains that you would have been familiar with, which are very sort of complicated looking, this is all covered in. It's trying to be aerodynamic. This is what's called streamlining. This process of designing so that it looks smooth and airplane-like is what we call streamlining. Virtually all airplanes, modern airplanes, are streamlined because they have to be. A lot of the things we're going to look at here are not streamlined because they had to be, it's because people wanted them to be. Yes, streamlining would increase the speed and decrease the amount of fuel used in something like a train, but it wasn't the most important thing. This made the train look modern and new. This, to contemporary eyes, 1934, was a symbol of newness. And we see something start off in a denotational way and then move into a connotational value. Now, lots of modern trains like Japanese bullet train Shinkansen and French TGVs are streamlined, and they're streamlined because they need to be, because they go that fast. But if we want to prove the point, let's take a look at something that has no need for streamlining whatsoever. This is a ferry. This is a ferry, again, from roughly the same period. 1935. This ferry is never going to move fast enough to need streamlining. However, it has all of those signifiers. It's clearly made of metal, it's enclosed, it has airplane like windows and shapes. If you look at the bridge, it almost looks like the front of an airplane. And this, again, was something that was considered, incredibly modern and forward looking at the time. None of this was being done for practical reasons. And in fact, there's a lot of things that make operating a ferry that looks like this somewhat difficult and impractical in terms of docking and access and emergency rescue and things like that. But the point is that this is, at this point, purely connotational. It didn't make the ferry go faster, cheaper to operate, cheaper to build. It's expressed an idea of speed, modernity, optimism, other attributes we'll see later on, without actually possessing those. There's no reason to believe that this is any better practically. It's that it has a different set of signifiers and is tapping into a different code. So let's look at another example. This is a duplicating machine, and this was a device that was used to make copies before things like photocopiers and laser printers, etc. And it has all the attributes of a late 19th, early 20th century industrial design. It has a certain amount of decoration to it, not a lot, but there's a certain amount. If we take a look at the wood turning on the handle and some of the shapes of the legs, and the parts that work are all fairly visible. This feels very much like an industrial machine as opposed to something you'd have in a home or an office. And what was this was developed into was by the designer Raymond Loewy, a famous industrial designer, into this Gestetner machine. Now, this is 1929, so we're talking about almost 100 years old, but we'll see that same influence to a certain extent of streamlining. It is covered over in the same way that landing gear and engines of those aircraft were covered over. It's simplified. We're using a wood base in one of them. The machine itself is smooth metal. It uses simple curves. And of course, the machine itself is not going to go anywhere. It's not going to fly through the air. It's not going to move anywhere at all. But it has that look of something more modern. The idea is to make it feel like this is a modern, contemporary device as opposed to something that's older. So what we have is a couple of ideas that interact. If we start off from the notion of just practical denotational meaning, it starts off in the notion of aerodynamics. Laws of physics and fluid dynamics suggest that if you want something to move through the air efficiently, it needs to be shaped and fabricated in a particular way. And because airplanes are very modern, there are no 1,000-year-old airplanes. There is, not a long history of airplanes that we can think about. They are in the 20th century, modern of necessity. That idea of aerodynamics and modernity gets linked together. Something else that also happens, and we'll, explore this later on, is also this gets linked together with hygiene. That is that people talk about clean designs. Now, in some ways, if you have certain types of materials and smooth surfaces, that makes something easier to clean. Quite a while ago, we talked about a meat slicer in a lecture, and that looked the way it was for in some reasons because it was easy to clean. But it also has the linkage to modernity to it. Now, this also has a dark side to it. And in one of the readings that we may do later on, we can consider whether this idea of streamlining also has links to some much more dark societal myths as well. But we're going to leave that for another day. And it's the bears again. Why do we keep coming back to this touchstone? Well, what we need to do is think about why things work. Why do we want to design a copying machine that's going to go into somebody's office, or a ferry that's going to go from one port to another, as if it were an airplane? Why are we going to use a pair of small, immature apex predators on the label of peanut butter? we need to think about this. We'll come back to it again. So to sum up a little bit, the modernist ethos, that is modernism with a capital M, can be summed up by the architect Louis Sullivan in terms of the phrase form follows function. Now, what does that mean? It means that in the world of modernism, you figure out what something is supposed to do, and then you create a form that allows that. So an airplane is an example of that. What does an airplane look like? Well, you don't get to simply pick what an airplane looks like. You need to design it based on its function. If you have strong opinions about what an airplane looks like that aren't based on aerodynamics, it's not going to fly. If we extend that into architecture, the idea is we think about what a building is supposed to do and we design it to allow that. A house, an airport, a hospital, etc., rather than deciding what something's going to look like at first. If we think about examples that don't come from the modernist world, think about the public buildings that look like classical Greek or Roman temples, that is, older libraries, university buildings, courtrooms. Is there any reason they should look that way? Not really. What is it about a pseudo-classical temple that makes it suitable for being a library or a hospital? Well, not much, because those buildings predate the modern ethos of form follows function. Now, in the postmodern world, we have a whole lot of playful adaptations of this, and people have created a various number of sort of sayings as a critique. One is that form follows function. That is, in the postmodernist world, you decide what something's going to look like and you invent it. In the reading, there's an example of the squid mixer. That is, it's a mixer for mixing ingredients when you're baking or cooking, and it looks like a squid, and you squeeze it in order to make the mixer move. That's simply invented. Is there any reason why a mixer should look or work like a squid? No, there's none at all. In the same way, there's no reason a juicer should look like, well, whatever you think the juicy salif looks like, a virus, a spaceship, whatever. And another way we might say, and this has also been said, is that form follows fun, that modernism itself tends to be incredibly serious, and postmodernism often involves, it's hard to say that it's funny as such, but a certain jokiness to it. And examples might be things like amusement parks or Vegas or something like that, where we can play around with the concepts. And so rather than being very serious and practical, we have things that may not do the job particularly well, but are fun or entertaining or exist for other reasons. So this is in some ways a contrast between the sort of notion of the staid designer, architect, planner, who thinks in terms of concepts, and then eventually those concepts are expressed by building it, and rather putting things together. Claude Levi-Strauss, who is a early structuralist and a important sociologist, says this. The bricoleur, and remember, bricolage is that do-it-yourself thing, is someone who works with his hands using devious means. Now, what does that mean by devious? Well, in the world of modernism, just going out and building something without pre-existing ideas or structure or plans is considered somehow dishonest. Just going out and putting it together. And the idea here is that somebody is not sort of following the existing rules, the rules that says you plan things and you research, you just sort of put it together. And that notion of a contrast to the ideas of serious modernism, conceptual thought, is something that's really expressed in some ways in postmodernism. One way to think of this might be sort of the punk rock aesthetic of the 1970s, where rather than, if you ever look at album covers for, punk bands like the Clash or the Sex Pistols, they look very sort of crudely thrown together, as opposed to other bands of the era doing progressive rock that had incredibly elaborate paintings and highly designed and thought through images. The idea was that you just you went out and did it, very much like the music itself. So there's that contrast between just going out and doing it and putting it together together with the tools you have at hand and the idea of researching, thinking, planning, etc. So one of the things that we also need to think about is form versus materiality. Materiality is sort of the thingness of something. It's, what it's made of and how it exists in the world versus the form, the shape that it takes. These are complicated concepts and, are much easier to do in a question and answer context and with a lot more examples, but we'll try it anyway. And so the idea here is that if you imagine, I'm going to stop that. A marker. No, I'm fine. I'll just cut this out. If we think about artifacts as texts that are things that are something that we can read, and artifacts, we mean designed objects, buildings, products, whatever. The material world then is this paradise of signifiers. That is, all the things that we build and use signify in some way. And that's the core of semiotics, thinking about how those things communicate as opposed to what they actually do functionally. So the question I'm going to leave you with is, what is the role of design? What is design supposed to do? Is it to convince people, as we've seen, and to solve problems? Is it rational or is it rhetorical? Are we trying to suggest solutions to things that are correct and practical, or are we trying to seduce people? And, we think about something like the Juicy Salif juicer. Is that a problem-solving exercise? What problem is being solved? Is it the best, most durable, most efficient juicer? No. It's a very popular product and made people a whole lot of money and moved their careers forward. So the question really is design a rational process or is it a rhetorical process? Is it about solving problems or is it about motivating and convincing people? We're going to pick this up later on in discussion, but that's the note that I want to end on. Thanks.